What is the Sharpe ratio and how do I calculate it for my portfolio? Hi, I'm Garrett Ray, financial planner here at the Wealth Guardians and the Ray Financial Group.
And I'm Brice Payne, and you've entered The Vault, the Wealth Guardians video series on all things pertaining to retirement planning. In this episode, we're going to talk about the Sharpe ratio. We're going to define it, we're going to talk about its importance, and we're going to go over how it's calculated. I'll once again bring your attention to these like and subscribe buttons down below the screen there. If you want to go ahead and click on those to make sure that you catch future episodes of The Vault with Doug, Garrett, and myself, please feel free to do so. Other than that, Garrett, let's go ahead and get into it now.
Yeah, Brice, so let's start off at the top. Let's define for the audience, what is the Sharpe ratio itself?
So there's a lot of different metrics out there when it comes to investing. We've done an episode on what the alpha is and how the alpha is calculated. There's the link for that one right up there. We've done an episode on the beta and how that's calculated and why that's important. So there's the link for that one up there. But the Sharpe ratio is really an important calculation to understand when it comes to trying to determine is your investment worth the risk that you're taking?
Sure.
It's a calculation that measures the relationship between an investment's risk and an investment's return. It was actually devised by an American economist, William Sharpe, in 1966. It's not a very complicated calculation. Garrett, you're an engineer. You've seen some complicated metrics out there, calculations. This is not one of them. But it's used to calculate the risk-adjusted return. That's really important there, the risk-adjusted return of an individual investment. It can also be used to calculate the risk-adjusted return of an entire portfolio for that matter as well. So that's what it is.
Okay, so we understand that, every investment has some amount of risk. And so we're going to basically gauge what risk am I taking versus what return am I likely to receive. So we understand that. As we go a little bit further, though, let's talk about the importance of the Sharpe ratio and how it helps us understand returns when we consider risk involved.
Exactly. So I think we would all agree out there that the riskier investments should provide a higher return.
Right. Why else take the risk?
Why else take the risk?
Yep.
So if you believe that, then the Sharpe ratio is something that would be important to you. If you don't believe that, then you wouldn't consider yourself with understanding the Sharpe ratio at all. But I'd also suggest that you might reconsider whether or not your determination that riskier investments do not need to yield you a higher return. That's pretty elementary right there.
Yes. Yep.
All right. So it's important to know the degree of risk of your investment or portfolio. If it's yielding you an adequate return for that degree of risk, or perhaps if there are other investments out there that for that same amount of risk could potentially give you a higher return or the same amount of risk or give you the same amount of return for a lower amount of risk.
Yeah.
You want to know that. Anybody should want to know that. So that's why the Sharpe ratio is understanding the number of your particular investment or of your portfolio is important.
Sure. Absolutely. So we've talked about what the Sharpe ratio is, why it's important, understand the amount of risk we're inside of an investment. Let's bring up some slides and go over its calculation and so people can better understand. So let's go over how it's calculated.
Okay. So as I said, this is not a particular hard calculation. We throw up that first slide. The Sharpe ratio is the expected return of an investment. That's the RX. R's for return and X is our particular investment, minus the risk-free rate of return. So let's generally consider that a T-bill. Okay.
Yeah, something that's government-backed, maybe some AAA-rated corporate bonds, something like that.
That's something you're not taking a lot of risk.
Got it.
So I would say a not even a municipal, but a federal bond where it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government.
Sure.
Something that's FDIC related. What is the expected return of those? So you take the expected return of your investment minus that return of a risk-free investment, and that's what we have now is our excess return.
Yep.
We'll go over some hard numbers here in just a moment, and then that's the numerator there, and then the denominator underneath that is the standard deviation. So you can take the standard deviation of your investment, you can find that out, and that's your denominator there. So let's go to the next slide here and just put some hard numbers in here. So let's say that your investment's historical return or expected return is 15%. But the expected or historical return of a risk-free investment is 3%. Well, 15 minus 3.
That's
12.
Yep. So that's our excess return.
There's our 12.
Yep.
And then let's say that the volatility of your investment or the standard deviation is 0.05.
Okay. So, has a volatility of 5%.
So that's gonna get us a 2.4.
Okay.
All right. So now we know what the Sharpe ratio is of our particular investment, 2.4. The next question would be, Brice, Garrett, is 2.4 any good? I have no idea.
Was that good, bad, indifferent? Who knows?
All right. So let's throw up the next slide. This is just kind of a starting point. Every advisor is going to have a different idea of what is a good Sharpe ratio versus a bad Sharpe ratio. If your investment is less than 1, that would generally be considered not a good investment.
Yep.
If you're between 1 and 2, all right, well, so now you're looking average or fair. If it's between 2 and 3, okay, hey, now we're starting to get somewhere. That's looking pretty decent. And then if it's above 3, wow, that's nobody should be unhappy with an investment having a Sharpe ratio of 3. So there you go. Let's Garrett, I've used in the past when we talked about the alpha, that it's really only fair to look at that metric when you're comparing apples to apples.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
The analogy I used then in that episode of The Vault was, let's say you've got a high school wrestler who wins 90% of his matches versus an Olympic wrestler who only wins 50% of his matches. If you're only looking at the percentage there,
right,
you would say, well, this guy is clearly the high schooler.
Yeah, the high
better wrestler than the Olympic guy, right? Well, you have to compare apples to apples, right? So let's throw up the next slide here, and this will show you why comparing it is also important here, comparing apples to apples. So we've got fund manager A, who's had a 20% return on his portfolio. We've got fund manager B, who has had a 30% return on his portfolio. Well, not all mutual funds are equal, right? Some mutual funds invest in stocks, some invest in bonds, some in riskier stocks, some in more stable stocks, some in high yield bonds. And then we've got the S&P's return here of 10%. These are hypothetical numbers.
Okay.
Well, if you're only looking at that top row, clearly fund manager B is doing a better job with his investments.
Yeah, why wouldn't we all just go with fund manager?
We all just go with that, all right?
Yeah.
Well, let's look at the Sharpe ratio. Maybe that puts it a little bit in perspective for us. If the higher Sharpe ratio is, as we defined in the previous slide, better to have, then that percentage there kind of becomes obsolete. Really, what's more important to us is that Sharpe ratio. Well, if fund manager A, even though he had only a 20% return, if his Sharpe ratio based on the risk that he was taking is a 2, but the amount of risk that fund manager B is taking to get his 30% is so much higher that the Sharpe ratio now is actually only 0.5. Well, now it starts to become clear that maybe for the amount of risk that you're taking, you're getting a better return with fund manager A.
Yeah, he is definitely, if you're looking at the Sharpe ratio there, fund manager A is definitely getting more efficient returns based on the amount of risk that he or she is taking. So, and that's really the crux of it.
That's exactly right. So thank you, William Sharpe, for coming up with this very basic. I'm surprised it took us until 1966 to really come up with this calculation.
Yeah.
Seeing that we have E equals MC squared. Way before that. This is pretty simple to understand. But anyway, there you go. That's what the Sharpe ratio is, why it's important, and why you might want to consider it if you're deciding whether or not your portfolio meets your expectations or your specific investment meets your expectations.
Excellent, Brice. Anything further to add?
I think that's going to about wrap it up for this episode of The Vault. Again, I'll draw your attention to these little like and subscribe buttons down there. Go ahead and click on those if you feel our Sharpe ratio is high enough for you to keep watching us and using your time for that. That's where the future episodes can be gone from, right there by clicking those buttons. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for this episode of The Vault. I'm Brice Payne.
And I'm Garrett Ray.
And this has been The Vault.